Good afternoon. My name is Nada Boškovska. I have the pleasure to welcome you to today's lecture. We have had a very rich program on Belarus in the last weeks. We have been looking at the events there from different perspectives. Today we will learn more about international politics in the region. As you all know, and as we actually can observe once more in the refugee crisis, the neighbors of Belarus are very much involved. Therefore, we have invited an expert on this topic. It is my pleasure to welcome Maksim Samorukov, who is a political scientist. He studied at the prestigious Moscow State Institute of International Relations, which educates quite a few of Russia's political, economic, and intellectual elite. Maksim worked after his studies for the independent news website Slon.ru for 5 years. He started there as a correspondent and then became an editor and international columnist, covering topics including Russian foreign policy, Central Eastern Europe and its relations with Russia, the Balkans, and the challenges of transitioning to democracy. Since 2015, he is a fellow at the Carnegie Moscow Center and deputy editor of the center's website Carnegie.ru. There he covers a broad row of topics. Just a few days ago, the Latvian Institute of International Affairs published a long text with the title Post-2020 Belarus, Security and Defense Implications to the Baltic States, Poland and NATO. Maksim contributed the part titled Perspective from Russia, Belarus and Russia, allies more in words than in deeds. Let me say a few words about the Carnegie Moscow Center where Maksim Samorukov is working. The center was established in the Yeltsin years in 1994 as a regional affiliate of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. The first directors were all foreigners. Dmitry Trenin, the actual director, since 2008 was the first Russian to lead the center. The Carnegie Moscow Center is a think tank dealing with complex issues on Russia and the countries of the former Soviet Union. The center's priority areas focus on foreign policy and security strategy, domestic politics and economics, and also societal trends. It combines local and regional expertise with a global perspective. The activities of the center are manifold. It has an English website and the publications are available in English. So if you are interested, you are welcome to go to the website and read what you are interested in. And the center also produces podcasts in English. If you ask yourself whether it is listed as a so-called foreign agent, it is not, because it is not a Russian entity, it's entirely foreign. It is just a branch of Carnegie Endowment for International Peace in Russia, and by that, not an agent, but as I said, completely foreign. Most of the funding comes from various grants. As Maksim told me, at the moment, the major donors are the Carnegie Corporation of New York, the EU delegation to Russia, the foreign ministries of Sweden and Denmark, etc. This list varies from year to year as some projects are completed and new ones started. Maksim, we are looking forward to your talk on Belarus and its neighbors, Russia, Lithuania, Poland. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Nada, for introducing me and the Carnegie Moscow Center. I'm very happy to take part in your talks about Belarus, which has become a very fashionable topic these days on international relations. As far as I've understood, we are supposed to spend around 1.5 hours together. And I hope that I won't be talking the whole time. Actually, I see that there are quite a few attendees here. And I would appreciate if at least someone will become visible, because otherwise I'm speaking to the dark screen which is not, not very encouraging. So I think if someone wants to turn on the video and join the talk in the video manner, I would be very happy about that, just because talking to the black screen is not very easy, yeah. So I plan to just, together with Nada, we've planned to organize the meeting in the following way. The first part of the meeting will be kind of my speech, my lecture, and I expect to devote it mostly to some basic things you need to know about Belarusian foreign policy and its relations with neighbors. Because today everybody is so much obsessed with the person of Lukashenko and the current crisis that sometimes people miss larger picture. Yeah, that they fail to make the difference what is connected to the person of Lukashenko and what is connected to Belarus as an entity which has existed before Lukashenko and which will continue to exist after Lukashenko. So I'll try to explain some basics, including historical one. And I think it will take half an hour and no more than that, maybe even less. And then we'll switch to the current crisis, which I guess most of the participants of the meeting have already heard about, and they have questions about it. And I will be very happy to answer them. And I think we can spend the rest of the meeting talking in detail about the current crisis, its reasons, its prospects, its main driving factors, etc. So don't expect too much information in the first part about the current crisis, because it will be more general overview. So to start, as far as I understand, most of the participants have some idea about what is Belarus, that it is a relatively small country in Eastern Europe, squeezed between Russia and the European Union, with just 9 million people population and with no major national minorities or separatist conflicts or something like that. So I'll start with explaining the two main things which has determined the Belarusian foreign policy, has been determining the Belarusian foreign policy for the past 3 decades, for all 30 years of Belarusian independence, because this year we have precisely the 30th anniversary of Belarusian independence, precisely 3 decades of its existence as an independent state. Yeah, it became independent in 1991 when the Soviet Union broke up. Yeah, the first driving force behind the Belarusian foreign policy is the Belarusian national identity, which is not very typical for this region of Central Europe or Eastern Europe. Belarusian national identity is relatively weak. Yeah, it appeared very late, even by the standards of the Russian Empire, only in the early 20th century. And it didn't have very strong appeal to the local population. And even before, on the eve of the First World War, there was not a single school teaching in Belarusian language appeared only during the First World War, and they were opened by the Germans in Vilnius, paradoxically, yeah, because Vilnius was the center of the Belarusian national movement. After the Russian Revolution, Bolsheviks debated a lot whether to create such a republic at all, whether the Belarusian nation is numerous enough and strong enough to need a separate Soviet republic. But finally, the question was resolved positively for Belarusians. The Belarusian Soviet Republic was created as an auxiliary, as an instrument in the Soviet war with Poland, because the Soviet Union saw that there are many people with Proto-Belarusian identity living in Poland, and the creation of Belarusian Republic would have helped the Soviet Union to export the communist revolution further. During the Soviet years, Belarus was the most Sovietized republic of all the 15 republics in the Soviet Union. Yeah, everybody, thanks to the Soviet education, everybody in Belarus knew that the majority of the population in Belarus are Belarusians, and they believed and they identified themselves as Belarusians, but they were not really passionate about that. It was not kind of the main ethnicity or national identity has never been a main issue for the population of Belarus. And because of that, on the eve of the breakup of the Soviet Union, the movement for independence in Belarus, unlike many other Soviet republics, was very weak. Yeah. In fact, Belarus became independent not because it strived for an independence, but rather because all other republics around it just quitted Soviet Union, and Soviet Union, which was around Belarus, just disappeared. Yeah. So this is very important because it had this, we can call it weak national identity. It has a great impact on the on the formulations of the foreign policy of independent Belarus. Belarusians never appreciated ethnic issues too much. The questions of historical disputes, questions of blood, of language, of religion, they were never high on the agenda of Belarusians. Paradoxically, Belarusians, unlike many other states in the region, they are more inclined to appreciate civic national identity more than ethnic national identity. This is not typical for any other country in the region. Yeah, but today, according to opinion polls, we see that actually the majority of Belarusian society is ready to consider a member of Belarusian nation, anyone who lives in Belarus. Yeah, they don't raise up, they're very this makes this country surprisingly multicultural, yeah, surprisingly tolerant. They don't raise any demands of you need to speak Belarusian language to be a Belarus, or they don't, you need to be born in the Belarusian family to be a Belarus, or you need to spend all your life in Belarus or to be a Belarus. No, you can be a Belarus, and the Belarusian society is ready to accept you as a Belarus, just if you live at the moment in Belarus. And this softens the conflicts with neighboring nations, first of all. Yeah, Belarus is probably the only nation in this part of Europe where anti-Semitism has never been a part of ethnic outlook. Yeah, or the only nation which has no major conflicts with neighboring nations in history. Yeah, if, for example, if the Ukrainian identity has always been constructed to a large extent in rejecting, in like trying to separate itself from Russian identity, Belarusians has never had these problems. Neither they had any territorial disputes with the neighboring countries. There were some, but they have never been that as acute as territorial disputes between other East European countries. This makes Belarusian society very tolerant, concentrated on civic nationalism rather than ethnic nationalism. And also there is no major domestic tensions like interregional tensions or interconfessional tensions, like between, for example, there is a significant majority of Catholics in Belarus, but there have never been large major religious disputes between Orthodox Christians and Catholics in Belarus, or there is no strong anti-Russian sentiment. And this allows Belarus to conduct cooperation with other countries without paying attention to historical disputes, to ethnic disputes, and all this stuff. And it also allows Belarusians to other issues like socioeconomic prosperity higher than the issues of ethnicity, yeah, or ethnic realization. So if you ask an average Belarusian, what do you value more, high level of economic prosperity or the ability to live in an independent, in a sovereign state with the ability to speak Belarusian language and to construct a Belarusian national state, they will opt for economic prosperity, not for the realization of Belarusians as a nation. The other very important driving force behind Belarusian foreign policy is the Soviet legacy. Because at the beginning of the Soviet Union, in the early years of the Soviet Union, Belarus was the most underdeveloped state in the Soviet Union. And moreover, it suffered huge losses, material and personal losses during the Second World War. So most of its current economy was created not during the Stalinist industrialization process in the 30s, like in many other parts of the Soviet Union, but much later, in the later decades of the Soviet Union. And Belarus was turned into kind of showcase republic where the best achievements of the Soviet industry were introduced. It's at the moment of the breakup of the Soviet Union, its economy was highly industrialized, and the factories constructed in Belarus were relatively modern and relatively competitive, at least by Soviet standards. Actually, Belarus was the Soviet Republic where you can get the goods of the highest quality. They are still not, the quality is not as high as in the West, but by the Soviet standards, Belarusian goods were considered to be of high quality. And this made Belarusian economy highly dependent on the Soviet market. Yeah, it was an export-oriented economy, but the only export markets its goods can find were other Soviet republics. And this situation is still valid, that the Soviet republics are still the main trading partners of Belarus, and the prosperity of the Belarusian economy is still highly dependent on its ability to sell the export of its huge Soviet factories to other markets in the former Soviet Union. Actually, Russia takes, it's kind of unprecedented figures that Russia still gets almost a half of all Belarusian exports. You can hardly find any other two countries where half of the trade is going to just one neighboring country. Probably Canada gets, probably United States gets more than a half of the Canadian and Mexican exports. But it's a very rare exception. Mostly, no country is that much dependent on its neighbor. But moreover, if you add up other Soviet republics, like the second largest trading partner of Belarus today is Ukraine, the second largest Soviet republic. And it gets another 10% of Belarusian export. And if you add up all former Soviet republics, you'll get that almost 2/3 of Belarusian exports is going to these republics, and it has nowhere else to go. If it loses its markets, it will lead to the bankruptcy of its huge factories with its huge employment, highly dependent on Russian energy imports. Yeah, and you have this, that Belarus, in fact, this Soviet industrial legacy, on the one hand, it created a relatively modern industry for this country. On the other hand, it made this country a hostage to the access to other markets of the post-Soviet states, especially the Russian market, which is, as the largest former Soviet republic, it holds all the cards, yeah, here. With these pre-existing conditions, Belarus arrived at its independence. And no wonder that from the very start of its independence, it was concentrated on achieving some kind of understanding and even reintegration with Russia. Because like without Russia, Belarusian industry, huge Belarusian industry, will just come to a halt. Energy from Russia, sell the manufactured goods. Actually, the economic relations between Russia and Belarus have been, during all the post-Soviet period, and they still are, quite quasi-colonial, because Russia is selling to Belarus mainly raw materials, while Belarus, as a metropolis, is selling to Russia manufactured goods, which are unable to find demand in other countries outside Russia. Yeah, and so from the very beginning, even long before Lukashenko became the Belarusian president in the mid-90s, the Belarusian leadership understood very well that if they want to preserve at least some level of social peace and economic prosperity, they need to improve relations with Russia. They need to find understanding with Russia, and they need to secure some kind of deal which will allow them to continue close economic cooperation with Russia. Otherwise, the country's economy will just collapse. And they found even before Lukashenko, under Kebich, who was the Belarusian leader before Lukashenko, these negotiations started and the liberalization of trade between Belarus and Russia started. But under Lukashenko, this took form of a kind of big deal between Belarus and Russia. What Lukashenko did is that for his to support his survival in power, to support his popularity in Belarus, he secured a privileged access to Russian market in exchange for close military cooperation with Russia. This was a big deal between Russia and Belarus, which is still valid, which is still appreciated both in Minsk and in Moscow. Belarus offers Russia close military cooperation and military loyalty, while Russia offers Belarus, pays back to Belarus for this loyalty with privileged access to Russian market and with cheaper energy to keep Belarusian economy going, to keep Belarusian economy functioning, and to keep jobs for Belarusians, for hundreds of thousands of Belarusians employed at these factories in this industry. And for Russia appreciated this military cooperation very highly, because for Russia, Belarus is probably the most important military ally out of anybody, out of any other country, because through Belarus goes the shortest way from the West to Moscow. And all the existential threats Russia has faced over the past several centuries, they were all coming through Belarus. It was during the Napoleonic Wars when Napoleon arrived at Moscow's gates through Belarus. And it was later in the Second World War when Hitler arrived to Moscow, again mainly through Belarus. So Moscow believes it to be very important to secure enough strategic depth with the help of Belarus to be able to protect itself from military threats from the West. And Moscow still thinks in these categories, that NATO is now the next edition of the Western threats is NATO and the United States. And we should, first of all, secure our Western front. And without Belarus, we will be unable to secure this front. In exchange, it is ready to offer Belarus quite substantial subsidies to its economy in the form of cheaper raw materials, first of all, gas and oil, but gas even more important because most of Belarusian industry is working on Russian gas and is very energy inefficient. Yeah, it demands too much gas in comparison to European production. And in order to remain competitive, at least in Russian market, it needs to secure the price level more or less similar to the price level inside Russia, because it's competing mainly in the Russian market and is competing mainly with the Russian producers who receive gas on the domestic price level. So Russia is offering cheap gas and oil, and Belarus has never considered abandoning Russia as a military ally. And this deal has existed since the early 90s, and it is still valid. And basically, why the Kremlin is so tolerant, there were many disputes over these 30 years because the terms of privileged access of Belarus to the Russian market has never been determined very clearly. Yeah, both countries have disputed and argued a lot about the details of this agreement. Yeah, about what should be the discount Belarus enjoys to Russian gas and what should be the level of taxes levied from, or custom levies levied on Belarusian exports or Belarusian imports to Russia. So the disputes were numerous, and Lukashenko has always been a very tough negotiator. But he has never put in question the general big deal military market deal with Russia, and Moscow has always appreciated that a lot. And the current level of tolerance of Lukashenko, of his, and past as well, yeah, of his attempts to diversify his foreign policy, or his attempts to get better conditions from Russia, his attempts to blackmail Russia with on some issues. All this has been tolerated by Russia, precisely because Lukashenko has never failed Russia on the military cooperation, which is like the cornerstone of the deal between Belarus and Russia. And this is the case till today. The same, like this understanding has proved between Russia and Belarus, has proved very resilient. Yeah, we still see it. And for the same reason, this understanding complicated Belarus relations with its Western neighbors, especially with Poland and the Baltic states. Because for these countries, Poland, Lithuania, Latvia, for historical reasons, and with some level of justification, they perceive Russia as the main existential threat to them. It's just their historical experience. And to address this kind of threat, they strive to create a buffer states between themselves and Russia, so that they no longer bother Russia directly. And they want to have neutral, or even better, friendly buffer states separating Russia from them. And Belarus could hypothetically could play such a role. And Poland and the Baltic states have always wanted Belarus to play this role of a neutral state, buffering them away from Russia. But Belarus was not able to play this role because it jeopardized its economic prosperity, it jeopardized its success to Russian market, and it's jeopardized actually its survival, its economical survival. And this was the root of the contradictions between Belarus and Poland and Belarus and Baltic states. Poland and Baltic states have always wanted Belarus to take a more neutral position, a less dependent on Russia position. They wanted Belarus to emancipate from Russian influence, to emancipate from the dependency on Russia. But Belarus was always afraid to do that. Belarus has always believed that the risks of such an emancipation are too high, and that it is not ready to do it yet. And this generated conflicts between them. And the other source of conflicts between them was I think this geopolitical source of conflicts between Belarus and Poland, which has destroyed all the attempts of rapprochement between them. We have seen many attempts of rapprochement between Lithuania and Belarus, between Poland and Belarus, but they have all been ruined by this contradiction that Belarus prized Russia as an ally too highly to be acceptable to Poland and Lithuania and Latvia. Yeah, and the other source of tensions between them is the democratic credentials of Lukashenko regime. Yeah? That Lukashenko, to stay in power, has always been eager to use the most ruthless methods, the most violent methods to survive in power. And anytime a slightest threat to his power, slightest domestic threat to his power appeared inside Belarus, he was ready to repress hundreds of people. He was ready to create hundreds of political prisoners. And every time like there was a tentative rapprochement between him and the European Union or the West, he has in a while, he was always destroying this rapprochement in fight for his domestic survival, in fight for his survival in power. And this was the cycle repeating itself several times over the past 20 years. We had a very active rapprochement around 2008, 2009, 2010, which was ruined by the elections in late 2010, when Lukashenko applied violent repressions against the opposition. And again, this cycle repeated itself recently when we have a rapprochement after between 2014 and 2020, which has achieved a lot, but was also ruined by Lukashenko's actions, his violent repressions against the opposition, which were even more violent and cruel than they were in 2010. So we have two problems. We have geopolitical problems between Belarus and its Western neighbors, and its direct Western neighbors in Poland and the Baltic states. And we have the problem of values, the problem of human rights, the problem of like humanism, yeah, like some basic rules of human behavior between Lukashenko personally and the European Union or the West in general. And I'll also add, we still have some time left. I'll also add another, because our subject is Belarus and its neighbors. Another important neighbor of Belarus is Ukraine. And the relations between Belarus and Ukraine have always been very elaborated and highly developed. And the main principle of these relations was that Belarus tried hard to at least partially replace Russia for Ukraine after the conflict between Russia and Ukraine erupted in 2014. Yeah, Belarus was actually benefiting on this Russian-Ukrainian conflict because Belarus was trying to replace the served economic ties between Russia and Ukraine. We see that up till today, despite all the arguments between Minsk and Kiev, current arguments between Minsk and Kiev, even after Lukashenko has recognized Crimea as a part of Russia, we see that economic cooperation between Ukraine and Belarus is still prospering because both countries need each other, especially after Ukraine has lost Russian market and Russian energy imports. Belarus now is still the largest exporter of diesel and gasoline to Ukraine. It's still an important seller of electricity to Ukraine, and it's still important trade partner for Ukraine. And Ukraine is still a very important market for Belarus, it's the second largest partner. And especially this year, when Russia has prohibited coal export to Ukraine, Belarus has become an indispensable energy partner for Ukraine, actually making for the losses in the Ukraine faces in cooperation with Russia. So I think I've been speaking for 35 minutes already, and I've given the general overview and like the basic principles of Belarusian foreign policy. And now I clearly understand that the highest interest is about the current crisis in relations between Belarus and actually everybody else. And I'm open to your questions, and I think everybody has heard something about that and knows what to ask about.
Thank you very much, Maksim, for outlining clearly this overall picture, the situation of Belarus between all its neighbors. Maybe I take the privilege to ask the first question. Belarus is some kind of a buffer state for everybody, it seems to me. It's for Russia towards the west, to NATO, and it's the same for Poland, Lithuania, and so on, for the west. So what do you think? Poland and Lithuania, they accepted very clearly, very quickly politicians in exile from Belarus. They offered asylum to Tikhanovskaya and many more. So how do you think would this opposition, if they had the chance to be the government in Belarus, would they be in a position to alter this policy towards the West, to open up towards the West, in considering that Belarus is so much dependent on Russia?
Yeah, that's a very good question. Actually, it's the very gist of the problem, of the current problem of Belarus. I strongly believe that even a very strong, even if some politician very strongly opposed to Lukashenko comes to power in Belarus, he or she will still face a strong economic dependency on Russia, which is impossible to dismantle even in 5 years, even in a decade. Yeah, and this process of dismantling will be very painful for the Belarusian society. The social and economic costs will be very high. So I think that we should not pay too much attention to the pre-election declarations of the Belarusian opposition politicians. Because no matter what they declare, but even though they declare mostly that they are quite eager to cooperate with Russia, yeah, but no matter what they declare, there is a very crude economic reality which they have to face as soon as they come to power. And this economic reality is that Poland is just a marginal economic partner for Belarus. It's just several percentage points of its exports, yeah, while Russia takes half of its exports and most of its imports. And in such circumstances, no matter what are your personal convictions or personal values or your general world outlook, you have to adapt to this reality. So I think that both Russia and Polish and Lithuanian leadership, they overestimated the ability of the Belarusian opposition to change this crude economic reality, that Russia was too sensitive to the threat of that without Lukashenko, it may lose Belarus. Yeah? No, it's highly unlikely that even without Lukashenko, it will lose Belarus. While the Polish and the Lithuanian and the Baltic countries' leadership believes that Lukashenko is the only problem, that Lukashenko is the source of all problems they have with Belarus. No, he's not. There are, even if you get a kind of ostensibly pro-Western government in Belarus, it will still have to manage its relations with Russia, and managing its relations with Russia implies finding some understanding and some form of close cooperation with it. So maybe if the opposition, in a hypothetical reality, yeah, an alternative reality, let's imagine that the opposition came to power in Minsk in 2020. I believe that the relations with Europe would have been better, but there would have been no breakthrough. Yeah, there wouldn't have been this kind of U-turn the Ukraine did after 2014. Yeah, it wouldn't be the same because Belarus can hardly afford that.
Oh, we don't hear anymore. Maxim?
Sorry?
We didn't hear the last sentences.
Sorry. I'll repeat them. That
is different from the Ukraine, you said?
Yeah, that such a U-turn Ukraine did in 2014 is unimaginable in Belarus, whoever comes to power, because just the economic and social costs of such a U-turn are too high, are unacceptably high.
Okay.
And moreover, there is no demand for such a U-turn in the Belarusian society. Actually, even in the current crisis, we see that the Belarusians who share Western values, but they don't necessarily project these Western values on foreign policy. That actually they want to live in a democratic country, but they do believe that they can combine living in a democratic country with a close cooperation with Russia. Yeah, that in Ukraine it goes together. Yeah, that like if you want to live in a democratic country, you have to conduct a pro-Western foreign policy. And Belarus does not. You can live, the majority of Belarusian society strongly believes that they can live in a democratic country and still conduct a Russia-friendly foreign policy.
Would you say that this is the reason for that is the economic necessity, or would you say that there are maybe some deeper roots between Belarus and Russia than with other countries?
I'd say it's
Russia
both.
And other countries of the former Soviet Union?
Yeah, I'd say it's both. Of course, economic dependency is very important, and people are working in these factories who are exporting mainly to Russia, and they're not stupid. They understand where they're exporting their goods to, and they very clearly understand that if they try to export them to Europe, it's unlikely that they'll get much demand for them because of the inferior quality. But there is also the question of national identity. That Belarusian national identity has never been very ethnic, as I said before. Yeah, that it has never had a strong anti-Russian sentiment. It was always the other way around. It was kind of very pro-Russian. And Belarus probably, many of the Belarusians, they are ready, for example, they don't, unlike any other country in Eastern Europe, they don't believe that if they want to be Belarusians, they have to speak Belarusian language. You can have lots of Belarusian patriots and even Belarusian nationalists who still speak Russian language and don't see it as an obstacle to their being Belarusians. This is unprecedented in the post-Soviet space and in the Eastern Europe in general. So it also impacts Russia-Belarus relations.
So I would like to open up the floor for the audience. You can write your questions into the chat, or you can raise the little yellow hand. I have already a question from Eva Meder in the chat. What would you recommend that the EU should do with regard to the migrant crisis? Stay firm and give up its humanitarian standards, or give up the sanctions towards Lukashenko's regime?
You know, I'm a Russian citizen, and I try not to make recommendations to the European Union or to Western governments because it may be considered some kind of meddling or them trying to make improper political impact. I'll try to explain this situation. Just the roots of the migrant crisis on the Polish-Belarusian border and Polish or Belarusian-Lithuanian border is in the miscalculations of Lukashenko. He is such a person. He is very emotional. He wanted to take revenge on his Western neighbors, and he wanted to force dialogue on the European Union. So actually starting this refugee crisis on the border between Belarus and the European Union, he intended to force the European Union to return to the dialogue with Minsk. But he miscalculated. Actually, what he achieved is the opposite. That unlike in Belarus has never been perceived as a threat inside by the wider European public, but now it is, because they see the current Belarusian regime as not as a terrorist one, but really as a unpredictable, crazy dictator who is ready to create crises on the borders of the European Union. And what I see in Europe, that actually this crisis, contrary to Lukashenko's expectations, has created a strong momentum inside the European Union to pressure the Belarusian regime much stronger than the EU initially intended to. So I think, no matter what are my recommendations, I think even Lukashenko now understands that his tactics has backfired, that actually he has made his own position in the West even weaker, and actually he has, contrary to his own expectations, he has mobilized the Europeans against him. So I think that we have already got some new sanctions against Belarus, and the sanction pressure on Belarus will continue to pile up. And Lukashenko, as a very stubborn person, is not able to stop the crisis just like this, just without losing his face. So he'll continue to talk about this crisis for a while in the future. But I think now it is clear that even he understands that it is better to settle the situation down. We see the planes going with refugees going back to Iraq and Syria. We see that the number of attempts to cross the EU border has decreased significantly several times. We see that diminished several times. Actually, the metro is already over. But so I think the European tactics was more successful than the one of Lukashenko. Actually, to bend to his pressure and refusing to bend to his blackmail, and consolidated an answer on the part of the European Union made it clear even for Lukashenko that he is actually shooting in his own leg, in his own foot, and he'd better for himself wrap up the crisis and stop this blackmail, because it's making the situation worse for himself.
We have raised hands. Sylvia, can you react to them, or I don't see how I can give the word? Nina, Stefan, we don't hear and see you.
Yes, can you hear me now or see me?
Yeah.
Or both?
We don't see you, but I can hear you at least.
Okay. Yeah, hopefully it will figure it
Oh,
out.
now I see you.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. So I'm currently writing a paper on Belarus, and like one of the questions that I've been looking at is sort of this national identity that you talked about before. And I stumbled upon a book called Struggle Over Identity by Nelly Beekes. I'm not sure if you're familiar with her work. And I would love your opinion or input on her thesis, because she sort of rejects what you mentioned previously, and she even goes so far to call it a cliche thesis that there is not a strong Belarusian national identity. And instead, she proposes that there are actually two national identities in Belarus, and she calls one the official Belarusianness and the other the alternative Belarusianness. And she goes on to say, essentially, like summarizing it really densely, because it's like a 250 page like thesis that she develops. But what she says is that in the official Belarusianness is sort of like an effort to continue the nation building that has been done during the Soviet period and sort of build on that and continue that. And the alternative Belarusianness, she claims, sort of sees the Soviet period as a colonizational period, and that the alternative Belarusianness is an effort to sort of build on the work of the first Belarusian nationalists. And she sort of goes on to explain that there is like these two different conceptions of the history of Belarus. One sees Belarus as a very close partner to Russia throughout the centuries, and the other sees it more critically. And I was just wondering, I don't know if you can do a statement on that, because you.
Yeah, okay. That's a very interesting issue, because because I found a link to the book I'd say is the very best book covering the history of the formation of Belarusian national identity. It's Anders Rudlin. He is one of the leading world specialists on Belarus and on the Belarusian history. I think this book is available electronically, I hope. Yeah, there is a Kindle version. And I strongly recommend to read it.
Okay.
Because actually, what you have said, it's a legitimate point of view, that, and it's quite accurate description of certain approaches shared by significant number of Belarusians. Now this which have been conducted for many years in Belarus. Yeah, that of course we have the Belarusians who share like this kind of how she called it, I don't remember, anti-establishment or anti-Lukashenko.
No, she just calls it the alternative.
Alternative, yeah. But how many people share this approach? Judging by the few democratic elections Belarus had in its past, and judging by opinion polls conducted in this country, we see that this approach is shared by around 15, maybe 20% of Belarusians at best. And this is hardly the majority, it's a significant minority, but it is far from being a determining majority. While the majority of Belarusians, their ethnic identity, okay, I wouldn't say it's a weak ethnic identity, but strong civic identity, that they prize their civic status as Belarusian citizens much higher than the Belarusian language or the Belarusian blood or something like that, or the the religion issue. That's just, it's obvious from discussions with with any Belarusian, and it's obvious from especially it becomes stark if you compare the situation in Belarus with the situation in Ukraine or the Baltic states or Poland. Yeah, it's very different here. And even the author you mentioned agrees that the process of constructing Belarusian identity is still going on, You can
Yeah,
you can hardly say the same about Polish identity, for example. Yeah. I don't think, you know, when we say weak ethnic identity, it sounds as something negative, as something that we are critical about it. I'm not critical about it. I think that this is good because it helps Belarusian to avoid, for example, numerous domestic conflicts, like the ones in Ukraine or Moldova, where we have separatist conflicts because of these contradictions between various parts of society. So I agree that this is an accurate description of the world outlook of some Belarusians. But I strongly disagree that this approach is shared by the majority of Belarusian society.
Okay, thank you. I'll definitely read the book that you recommended. I was wondering, can I ask a second question that is not related to this first one at all, or is there a lot of people who would like to ask questions as well?
No.
No, go on.
Okay. So this is more of a statement I have read in different newspapers, and I would love to hear your opinion on it. And it was stated that one of the reasons why Russia, or like Putin, I guess in that sense, would be interested in keeping Lukashenko in power is because it is presumed that it would send a dangerous message sort of to Russia if, you know, a revolution in that sense against an authoritarian or autocratic regime would be successful, in a fear that this might happen in Russia as well. Do you agree with that, or do you not really see this as a plausible concern?
No, I think it's quite plausible. And of course, like Ukraine and Belarus are very special countries in this respect because of many interpersonal connections. They are not just foreign countries for the majority of Russians. And many Russians project the events there on the Russian reality. And the Kremlin has no desire to allow a successful revolution in Belarus and the demonstration that actually you can change the regime in elections, even in the elections in authoritarian state. Yeah, but I don't think that there is any longer a threat of successful revolution in Belarus now. I think that the Kremlin, now Lukashenko has suppressed their position by very cruel and violent methods. And he has not restored his popularity for sure. He's still highly unpopular, but people are afraid to protest just. The price of protest has been made so high that people are not ready to go out to streets to protest. So I don't see any direct threat of the repetition of the events of the August 2020. And I think that for Russia, the main concern now is not precluding a revolution in Belarus, but rather precluding another deep political crisis. And to achieve that, to preclude it, Russia is ready to pressure Lukashenko to conduct some kind of controlled transit of power, controlled and very limited constitutional reform, so that to avoid another similar crisis in the future, yeah, that because all opinion polls demonstrate that the majority of Belarusian society are mostly discontent by personally Lukashenko. They are ready to support good relations with Russia. They are ready to tolerate some kind of limits on their democratic freedoms and all this stuff. But the main irritant for them is personally Lukashenko. And to make this Belarusian kind of regime as a whole survive longer, Russia understands very well that you can just replace Lukashenko with any other person and make the regime in Belarus much more resilient. So what we see now is the pressure coming from the Kremlin on Lukashenko to conduct the constitutional reform, to write a new constitution. The changes will be slight, but the most important thing here is that the new constitution implies that Lukashenko will step down at the end of his current term, no later than the end of his current term. And after that, you'll have probably an appointed successor. There will be no genuine democratization. Russia don't want a genuine democratization in Belarus. They would just want to renew the regime to make it more resilient and to get some more. They also understand that Lukashenko is losing the grip of power, that he's becoming too emotional, too nervous. He is kind of losing his rationality. They want to have a new generation of authoritarian leadership in Belarus, probably with a security background, which is more rational, which is less, which is irritating Belarusian society less than Lukashenko does. So kind of this controlled renewal of the regime, not the genuine democratization. But even this controlled renewal, its main element is that Lukashenko will not run for president again. Maybe he'll take some respectable position and influential position inside the new structure of power in Belarus, inaugurated by the new constitution, but he will no longer be the president.
Can you tell us a little bit more about this inner circle of power in Belarus? We hear only Lukashenko here. Is there any other persons? Are there any groups who are to be considered? Or on whom would the Kremlin build up?
Yeah, of course, Lukashenko is omnipresent in Belarus, and it's just kind of this perception of Lukashenko, hearing always about Lukashenko, is justified to some extent, because he is running the state very closely. Yeah, he has very hands-on approach on everything, not like Putin in Russia, yeah, which was still quite collective. But Lukashenko is looking into everything what is going on in the country. But still, there is especially after this crackdown on the opposition, you see a new ruling security elite formating. If you take all the positions, all the highest positions in the Belarusian state hierarchy, like the head of the government, the head of the presidential administration, heads of the security services, you see that there are people with security background, mainly from KGB, Belarusian KGB, and but they are 20 years younger than Lukashenko. They are more pragmatic, they are less ideological, they are less obsessed with preserving Soviet heritage, and they are, in their world outlook, they studied in Russia, in their world outlook, they are very similar to the current Russian leadership. Yeah, it's kind of capitalist securocrats, I'd call it, state capitalist securocrats, who are, on the one hand, very pragmatic and rational, on the other hand, strongly anti-Western. So I think out of these people, it will be that Lukashenko and the Kremlin together will choose a person out of this array of high security dignitaries to replace Lukashenko as a president, because it will be acceptable for Lukashenko, because he trusts his security services most, and it will be acceptable to the Kremlin, because the Kremlin doesn't trust Belarusian civil bureaucrats. They are afraid that civil bureaucrats in Belarus may be too pro-Western, may be eager to change the foreign policy course of the country. So they'd rather, and people sitting in the Kremlin, they are themselves of security background. They have better understanding with Belarusian people from security services in Belarus. So I think this will get together, and the Kremlin and Lukashenko together will choose his successor, someone like a former KGB officer around 50 years old, something like that. And I think he's already in high position. I think like the current head of the KGB may be this next president, or the current head of the government, of the Belarusian government may be the next president, or the current head of the presidential administration may be the next president. You don't have any deficit of such candidates. Yeah, there is a row to choose from.
Are there more questions from the audience? So this was not a very optimistic outlook for Belarus in the sense of civil rights and democratization and so on. So what do you think, how sustainable would such a solution be?
I'd say, yeah, it is not, because I think the transit of power, which will start probably with the constitutional referendum, which will take place in February, in 3 months, even less than 3 months. Yeah, they'll start this process of transit of power, which will take 2 or 3 years, I think. But even after it is completed, and when Belarus has a new president, it will not still be a democratic country. It does not imply the genuine democratization of Belarus, though it still implies some softening down the regime, probably some form of amnesty for political prisoners, and halting the current level of repression, like bringing down the current level of repressions, because it's just unsustainable now. Yeah. Probably the next regime will feel more confident. The next president will feel more confident to liberalize, producing some procedures, but to liberalize in terms of tolerating some personal freedoms, tolerating probably greater freedom of speech. Again, to some extent, yeah, not to great extent, and being less cruel in applying repressions to the civil society in Belarus. But the genuine democratization in Belarus, I'm afraid it is not possible until a genuine democratization in Russia, because as long as the Russian regime is interested in having Belarus as a loyal ally, it will have enough resources to impose some kind of soft pro-Russian authoritarianism on Belarus. Yeah, and it will have enough resources to sustain it in power, no matter what are the costs. Yeah, any costs inside Belarus are bearable for Russia. So I think, as it was in the past, if you want Belarus to change significantly, the significant change has to occur in Moscow, as it was in late Soviet times, when Belarus was the most Soviet republic, and the change came just from outside. Yeah, it made it democratize and become independent. And this time it will be the same. It's only when Russia starts some kind of democratic reforms, they will become possible in Belarus as well.
We have Eva Meder in the chat again. Please excuse if I return to the topic of sanctions, but how would you assess the cost of the sanctions on Lukashenko to the present day? Or in other words, can they have an impact as long as Russia is supporting him?
I'd say my answer to the first question is high costs, but my answer to the second question is yes. Is no, that Russia can afford compensating Lukashenko any costs of European sanctions, because Belarusian economy is just a fraction of the Russian one. Yeah, and Russia will always have enough resources to support Belarusian economy and Belarusian regime, no matter how strong the Western sanctions against Belarus. But still, I think Lukashenko did not expect this level of sanctions coming from the West, and he underestimated the ability of the European Union to come up with a sanction pressure so well coordinated and so strong, which is applied now to Belarus. The costs are just starting. The costs of these sanctions are just starting to materialize. Yeah, and I also think that I lost my thought, sorry, but no matter, it doesn't matter. Yes, currently, that is the problem, the current problem with the Western sanctions, that on the one hand, they are imposing high costs on the Belarusian regime and on Lukashenko. But on the other hand, the direct consequence of these costs is that Belarus is becoming even more dependent on Russia. So the higher the costs, the more dependent is Belarus on Russia. And this is hardly the outcome the EU intended when introducing the sanctions. Yeah, the intended outcome was totally different, and the European Union does not appreciate Belarus becoming a complete Russian satellite. Yeah? But that is a problem. On the one hand, Lukashenko himself is doing everything to create new reasons for new sanctions. Yeah, because I've spoken to many European diplomats early in the year, and they realized very well that with new sanctions, they are pushing Belarus into Russia's embrace, and that Belarus is losing its sovereignty because of this sanction. And they were ready to start some kind of a dialogue with Lukashenko. But on the other hand, Lukashenko keeps doing stupid things which make any dialogue between him and the European Union impossible. Yeah, first it was the forced landing of the Ryanair flight, yeah, which just the new sanctions were inevitable after that. And now we have this migrant crisis on the border, which is also a reason for another sanctions, and which also makes any dialogue with Lukashenko impossible. So this is the dilemma the European Union is facing is very difficult, because it cannot ignore the violations of human rights Lukashenko is undertaking on the one hand, and on the other hand, it also clearly realizes the more sanctions it applies to Belarus, the more dependent Belarus becomes on Russia.
I think that one aim of the sanctions is that he loses more and more the backing in the people. So how do you see that? Has he any backing in the population?
I say his backing has fallen significantly after the elections in 2020. Now it is estimated to be around 25–30%, and that is significant but minority. And despite all his efforts after the election, after the peak of the crisis in August and September 2020, he has failed to recover his popularity to any extent. Yeah, it's just his selling. 30% is his selling, and this is his nuclear supporters. Mm-hmm. And it's highly unlikely that any further sanctions will make them change their mind. But still, it's already a minority. So the question, Lukashenko has demonstrated that he's able, with the loyalty of his security services and with the Kremlin's support, he is able to survive in power, even in the situation when he's not supported by the majority, when the majority of the population is opposed to him, is strongly opposed to him, and when he is supported just by a significant but minority of the population, just around 30%.
We have the question, how will Lukashenko react if Russia really kicks him out of office?
I think it's not on the table now, yeah, kicking him out of office, because he himself, he's not just, he's a more complex personality than many believe him to be. Of course, he is obsessed with power, and he is ready to sacrifice everything for that. But he also has a sense of legacy, a sense of mission, and he believes himself to be a father of Belarusian independence, a father of Belarusian sovereignty, and he wants, deep inside, he believes his main priority is to preserve the Belarusian statehood he has nurtured over the past 25 or 27 years already. Yeah? And he himself realizes that, judging by his public statements, yeah, even he himself realizes that he has stayed in power too long, and that it is time for him to go, because the risks of him staying in power longer are becoming too high. And he doesn't want Russia to swallow Belarus, that's for sure. So here, he has an understanding with the Kremlin on that point, that there should be no more presidential elections with Lukashenko running. And I think and even judging, the constitutional referendum will take place in February. It's just 2.5 months before that. And the text of the constitution has not been published yet. So Lukashenko has stated many times that there will be a referendum on new constitution, but the text, we don't know what is inside the new constitution. The text has not been published. And this is another proof that actually Lukashenko has reconciled himself to the necessity to leave the presidential position, but he has not yet decided what is the best way to do it, what is the most secure way for him to do it. And that's why he is searching hectically in this how to write in this new constitution some guarantees for himself when he leaves presidential position. Yeah, because if he did not intend to leave the presidential position, he would have presented the text of the new constitution long ago, because it's nothing difficult about that. Yeah, you just change something here and there, and you say that like as a token gesture of democratizing, you add that no person can occupy the position of president more than 2 terms in a row. And this is kind of a new constitution. And Lukashenko himself, under new constitution, may run again for president for another 10 years, yeah, for another 2 terms. But he's not doing that, because even he himself, and also even more than him, the Belarusian security elite, the Belarusian security ruling elite, which is mainly much younger than Lukashenko is, all of them, they want to survive after Lukashenko, because Lukashenko is 70, yeah, and most of the securocrats in Belarus are just 50, and they want to survive after that. And they clearly understand that Lukashenko should not run again for president for their survival, to preserve the system even without Lukashenko. And on that, they can agree. They agree with Kremlin on that. So you have kind of coalition or common understanding between main actors here. Every one of them, the Kremlin, the Belarusian ruling elite and security elite, and even Lukashenko himself, they all agree that he has to go. So the question of kicking him out of office is just not on the table.
What about holding him responsible for things what happened? Maybe, so do you think that the sanctions would be lifted after that, or would the West insist that maybe he would be held responsible for the violence?
I don't think that personal sanctions against Lukashenko will be lifted, and probably some of the most implicated in the violence members of his regime, I'm quite sure that they will remain in force even after the constitutional referendum, or even after the change of president in Belarus. That's for sure. But I do think that the West will lift much of the sanctions, economic sanctions applied against Belarus. Probably not immediately, but in a while, yeah. Because the next leadership of Belarus is sure to be much more rational and much less violent than Lukashenko is. Yeah, but holding him accountable, I don't believe that's possible. Because, okay, he will leave presidential post only under ironclad guarantees that he will not be persecuted. And I think that the Belarusian ruling elite and the Kremlin, both of them, yeah, are ready to offer him such guarantees for himself and for his family, because he has 3. So I think you need, again, we arrive at the same point, that to hold Lukashenko accountable, the change of regime in Belarus is not sufficient, yeah, to achieve that. You need a change of regime in Russia, and this is probably out of question for the foreseeable future. And Lukashenko is already not that young. He is almost 70, and his life is very nervous. Probably his health is also not in the best shape, taking into account all the pressure he experiences. So I think I'm quite skeptical about that. But I don't think that is the most important thing about Belarus. Yeah, that I think that even this limited renovation of the Belarusian regime is better than nothing, than keeping Lukashenko in power. And, you know, because in such situations, it very often starts with some limited, controlled reforms but then they get their own momentum, and you have the situation developing in a very different way. Yeah. So I think the very start of the process, even this kind of very formal and seemingly unimportant referendum on the new constitution, is still a very important milestone in the Belarusian development, because it will start the process of, keep in mind that Lukashenko is still the first and the only Belarusian president. So the very fact that Belarus will get a new president, the second president, yeah, will be a major boost to its statehood and to its development.
Are there any questions left? I don't see a hand or questions in the chat, so I think that were a very good concluding remarks, Maksim, from your side. Thank you very much.
It was a pleasure.
Very interesting insights we got from your lecture and from the discussion. In the end, I would like to turn the attention of the audience to our last lecture next week. My colleagues Benjamin Schenk and Julia Richers from Basel and Bern will have a discussion with the editorial staff of Decoder. Decoder, if you don't know it yet, is an online media source which translates Russian independent media sources into German, while contextualizing them with Russian studies in German academia. So that is
including a lot of stuff published at carnegie.ru. They translate a lot of our Carnegie stuff into German and about Russia and Belarus and all other post-Soviet space. We have good relations with them. So
I think that will be a very interesting discussion. So I invite the audience to attend next week. And for today, we are closing our session today, and see you next week, and have a nice evening. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It was a pleasure to take part.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for the invitation. Goodbye.
Bye.